Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Those of you that saw my lightning talk yesterday know that I was talking about 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 space mission. Last year, 2018, was another important 50th anniversary in space and the like. It was the 50th anniversary of the release of 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the finest films ever made. And one of the good things about it being the 50th anniversary last year, was that it actually went back into the cinemas, and I actually got to see it on a big screen twice last year, which I hadn't done since 2001. And it's a very thought-provoking film, so I'm sitting there watching it for the second time on the big screen, and I'm starting to think about things. And of course, you start thinking about monoliths. Now, you're all programmers, you've all dealt with monoliths, so I think you probably know what I'm talking about. Monolith is a piece of code that was written a very long time ago by people that didn't really know what they were doing. It was still maintained by a brand new team long after all the original programmers had moved on. But at least we all got to stay in nice hotels when we went to conferences and to give talks about how terrible our code base was. All of which goes some way towards explaining why this talk is called Monoliths, Balls of Mud, and Silver Bullets. Monoliths, in the code meaning, are bad. I think you probably all realize that. Monolithic balls of mud are even worse. This is never as much fun as it looks. But that's okay, because microservices will save us. Hurrah! Well, that's the theory. As you'll notice, looking up at me, you will know I am old. And old people, well, old people either have long memories or they have very little memory. I'm still at the phase, I think, where mostly I have a very long memory. Or to put it another way, those who refuse to learn from commit history are doomed to re-implement it. Who here recognizes this book? Surprisingly large number of you, actually, and some young people, which is good. So this is a book called The Mythical Man Month, by a chap called Fred Brooks. This was something like the 20th anniversary edition, which I bought whilst I was at college, which was back in the last millennium. So it's a book that's been, I think it was originally written in about 1977 or something like that, but it's full of wisdom. Fred Brooks says things like, adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. And I'm pretty sure you've all seen that happen. He also says, I particularly like this one, for the programmer, as for the chef, the urgency of the patron may govern the schedule completion of the task, but cannot govern the actual completion of the task. And I'm sure you've all seen evidence of that as well. But for our purposes, the important thing that he says is there is no silver bullet. And that's so important that it's well worth repeating it in a larger font. There is no silver bullet. And because there is no silver bullet, we start thinking about a completely different set of films, of course, silver bullets. But because there are no silver bullets, we must realize that microservices are not going to be a silver bullet. They aren't going to save us in the way that some people might like to think. At this point, if you could all just click the button on the bottom of your seats to indicate that you accept the disclaimer, we'll move on. So, what do people tell us are the advantages of microservices? Simplicity. Well, I'm old, as I said, I'm not having that. I might, at a push, agree with less complexity. Less complexity. Ownership. Smaller projects, you give ownership to a smaller group of people in your organization. That leads to autonomy, and that, in theory, leads on to faster releases. This is, from the classic literature telling us why microservices are a wonderful thing. So let's take a look inside your monolithic ball of mud. I actually just Googled for images of monolithic balls of mud, and I came up with this, which actually does look quite familiar. Oh, what someone's done here is they have, around the edge of the circle, is they've plotted all of the classes in their system, and the red lines map the interactions between the classes. So there's quite a lot going on there. And actually, he's missed half of the system, because over on the side there's a huge great database, the monolithic database, and a bloody great data pipe going between the... so what does the microservices version look like? And I've worked on microservices projects. I know what it looks like. You have all your little microservices all sitting there in their own nice little Docker container. And on the side you've got a monolithic database, and the data pipe just spits. We call this microservices on a monolithic database, and it is a terrible idea. Who owns the database schema? What happened to that autonomy that we were talking about earlier? How do you go about changing the database schema? Because you've still got to get agreement from all the other teams. Or more specifically, how do you ensure that any changes that you do make to the database schema don't end up screwing other people? Microservices need micro databases. And of all the microservices projects that I've worked on over the last 5-7 years, that's the most common mistake that I see people making. That they've got a monolith and they're replacing it with microservices, but they don't get round to replacing the database. So you kind of lose out on the simplicity, and you lose out on the ownership, because the database is still this massive, vitally important shared resource. Another thing to think about when you're going to microservices architecture: how many stacks do you need? So you're going to need a development stack, and that's going to have a few different instances running in their Docker containers. Then you need a QA stack. Probably want some kind of integration stack. Production stack. Probably need 2 versions of the production stack at least. Oh, and by the way, how many development teams do you have that all need their own stack? I know that AWS is a cheaper way to host stuff, but it still costs money. One client I worked for a couple of years ago, the CTO told me that he used to weep every month when he got the AWS bill, because it was just huge. So just so you don't think that the talk is a complete waste of time, a few tips that you might like to take away if you're thinking of moving from a monolith to microservices. Microservices are REST over HTTPS. I know you can implement it in many other ways, but really, if you're not doing it that way, you are wrong. Most importantly, be a SOAP dodger. If somebody ever tells you they want you to interact with SOAP, then run very, very quickly in the opposite direction. JSON is the standard payload, and there's really very little need in the vast majority of cases to go elsewhere. Remember that HTTP is more than just get and post. There are other verbs that you can use in HTTP, and it's very common to translate the standard CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete. So you've got the get and post that you know, but also using put, delete, sometimes patch to do more interesting operations. Who's seen this diagram before? No one? It's from a piece of software called Web Machine, and it's a state diagram telling you which HTTP status code you need to return under certain circumstances. So it starts off asking you, is the service unavailable? If it is, then return a 503. And there's all these questions, and it just very, very hard to get this right. So use a library like Web Machine, and there is a Perl implementation to make your life easier. Assume that your private API that you're using to run this stuff will become public. This will happen in one of two ways. Either you will decide that your private API is so useful that you do the necessary work to tighten it up and make it public, or someone just hacks it and it will become public. So issue API keys right from the very start so you can trace the usage of your API. Version your API. That's an interesting one. A company that I was doing some work for not very long ago was making an external call to a supplier, to an API call every night. Came in, well, I wasn't on the pager rotor, but I came in one morning to find that there had been complete chaos overnight because this client had updated their API at 2 a.m. or something like that, and suddenly all the processes stopped. Oh, but they sent you an email 8 weeks ago telling you that on this time, on this day at 2 a.m. in the morning, they were going to make these changes to the API, so that's all right then. No, what you do is you have API /1.0, and then you put live API 2.0, and you give your clients time to move over in their own time as and when they want to. You do not force them to get their programmers out of bed at 2 a.m. in the morning to deal with your changes. Use HAL, the hypertext application language. That's a whole new other talk that I'm not going to go into. Generate documentation from the specification of your API using, it's not called Swagger anymore, it's called OpenAPI. And most importantly, emulate Johnny Cash, by which I mean destroying the monolith one piece at a time. Identify a piece of your monolith that really doesn't seem to fit, take and implement that as a microservice, start calling that instead of that piece of the monolith. When that works, find another little part of the monolith, turn that into an API, and at some point, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in the future, you will find your monolith just doesn't exist anymore, or it's still there, but you just touch it and it falls to pieces, and it's all been moved to API, to microservices. That, at least, is the dream. Thank you very much for listening. I think I have 5 minutes for questions. So the question is how good a solution is it if you stop at a halfway state where some of it has been moved into microservices and some of it still stays in a monolith. And of course, following my suggestions, that is a situation that you will be in for some period of time. I would suggest it's not something that you want to aim at as your end game, but I have been on projects where we have got a certain distance of the way through, and suddenly the re-architecturing has become de-scoped or less important. So it does happen that you get stuck in a halfway house. Actually, one important thing that I didn't mention is a good test of when you're confident that a particular part of the monolith has been successfully implemented as a microservice is you go in and you delete that part of the code from the monolith, and that's quite a satisfying way to prove to yourself that. So, but yeah, getting to that stage, I wouldn't recommend it, but I can understand why it is necessary sometimes. Any other questions? No, I'm so clear.
So the monolith was created at some point for some reason. What avoids that whatever you create with your microservices will also end up at some point as another monolith. So the monolith wasn't a monolith in the beginning. Somehow it started as 10 lines of Hello World.
Yes. Monoliths are, as I jokingly hinted at, written by people that are working under great pressure to get something live very quickly, with not really much idea of what they're doing. And of course that could still apply to some of us writing the microservices. But the point is that in a monolith you have every single part of your system in a single code base, and they all, sometimes for reasons that really aren't very clear, they will all talk to each other in the same way as that red circle. If you've at least unpicked the microservice and you've defined the interfaces that has with the rest of the system, it could be badly written. It could need throwing away and replacing in 5 years' time, but it's not going to be a monolith. It's only going to be a much smaller, smaller self-contained part of your system. So that even in the worst possible case, it's still better than it being part of the monolith. No more questions? Oh.
How do you solve the problem? Thank you. How do you solve the problem of God objects? Because you've got your single monolithic database, which owns your key business objects, and then with every service having its own little DB, are they going to start re-implementing the same fundamental concepts, and will they go out of sync doing that?
Yeah, like I said, microservices don't solve everything. It's important to document what you've got in your microservices. It's important to document the interfaces between your different microservices. And it's important for teams that aren't working on a particular microservice to know what is available in the other microservices. Talking to each other goes some way to alleviating that problem. I don't know that it's a problem that's been solved in the general case. Probably the last question.
What about very good old monolith that works for 40 years on some mainframe, replicating to some tape drives, and they work perfectly well? Are they good, or they should be?
You mean the kind of monolith that's probably writing your paycheck or looking after all your money in the bank? Yeah. I confess that all of my experience has been dealing with monoliths that were written in the white heat of the first .com boom, sort of 20 years ago. I mean, I'm sure there are arguments for doing similar things to those systems, because although they are, as you say, running smoothly and printing your paychecks and looking after your money in the bank or whatever they are doing, You still hear horror stories of teams of people that are terrified to look at, that are terrified to make changes to these systems because nobody understands the code. The person that wrote this piece of the code retired 30 years ago, and nobody else understands it. So there is an argument for re-implementing them, and the banks have the money to do it. Yes, but you can't change them. You can't. As surely the environment in which they work changes some way, maybe at a slower rate than we're used to. But maybe they need to deal with a new tax rule or something like that. So they have to be maintained. So the easier they are to maintain, the better for everyone. And that's my time. I think that's... Oh, there's another talk here in 5 minutes' time. Thank you.